I know, right? The way we hold on to our trauma, it's absolutely painfully wrong. You know, we all have these things that happen to us in our lives, right? And we think for some reason, the stronger we are means that we can hold on to more of them, right? And we stack them up into a big pile. And we think that if we have the biggest pile, we're stronger, we're better. We could conquer life. You know, I love kids. I think kids are awesome, right? You know, the littlest kids, right? You go out on a day and you get on your bicycle, you're doing skids, right? And you're at the beach and you're building sandcastles because they're amazing. You know, you're going down in the woods, you're building a rope swing, you're swinging, you're playing Lego, you're doing Barbies, you're doing all of the things. And we all think that we're stronger and we're better because it's awesome and kids are awesome. But there's like a strata of kids. There's little kids, and then there's a little bit older kids, and then there's the big kids, which is us, right? And little kids and the little bit older kids, they don't always play together, right? And I knew this little kid, he was awesome. He loved to play, but the older kids, they didn't want to play with him because they were the older kids. They were doing cool older kids things. And the cool older kids would go off and they'd go do their thing, and the little kid was just left to play with the dogs and with the adults, color in his coloring book. That's what he did. But one day, one of the bigger, older kids walked up to the little boy and said, "Hey, little boy, why don't you come play with me? I'm going to show you the secret bookcase that we have in our house." The little boy was so amazed. And they opened up this secret bookcase. And behind, underneath the stairs, the secret bookcase moved, and they saw a mattress. There were some posters on the wall. And the little boy and the older boy spent some time in that space. And that older boy did things to that little boy that nobody should do to kids, ever. Because it's wrong. And right at that moment, that little boy picked up one of those books. And he carried that book for so long. I grew up by sitting at university watching Oprah, because that's what you do when you eat beans, because you're broke. And I'm watching Oprah, and Oprah's doing this show on children who were sexually abused. And all of a sudden, the tsunami opened, and I've had all the feels. I realized what happened to me as the little boy. I cried. I was debilitated. My best buddy and roommate, Gus, came in the door. He came in, he sat, and he listened. He listened to me. He found out what was going on with me. And I started to unpackage with him that day what had happened. And I realized that through the work of unpackaging the things, that had lots of things, right? And we all have lots of things. I happen to have a book on sexual abuse, but I also have a book on having a lisp, because as a little kid, I used to talk like this, right? I have a fat kid book. I was the fat kid that did really well on top of the snowbank. No kid could push me over, right? And I was the anchor for the tug-of-war team because I was the fat kid, right? I was illiterate. When I went to university, my professor called me illiterate. I have ADHD, I've been on welfare, and I've been on unemployment. But you know what? Each one of those books that we have are an absolute opportunity. Each one of these things that happen to us individually and uniquely in our lives is an opportunity. You see, you don't get to choose the books that life hands you, but you choose what you do with them. You choose what you do with these books that happen in your life. You see, I know full well that these books, I wouldn't have chosen to have a lisp or to be sexually abused. I wouldn't have chose any of those things, right? But what I did choose to do is process them. So whether it was with professionals, whether it was with my friends, whether it was through reading books, whether it was through introspection, whether it was through changing lifestyle, I processed what happened. And that's where the strength comes from. I learned a little something called appreciative inquiry. There's this whole body of research called appreciative inquiry. And one of the tools in appreciative inquiry is understanding what's happened before in a problem, how you solved it, and then applying it to future problems. What do you do well, and how do you apply that to the future problems that you're having? Bango. That was awesome. Because what I realized is that little boy, that book that I had, I could take that problem and I could learn from some of these other problems that I'd been carrying along and I had learned from so well, right? And I learned as an entrepreneur that my problems don't have to be solved 100%. 80% and go. You see, because you don't have to understand the breadth of everything. What you have to understand is enough to know that you're going to move forward and you're going to find the answers. That's what you have to know. And you have to know that the answer's out there and that you can do it. And the tool that I used is Socratic method. I sit down with each one of these problems that I have, and I go through the process of what, so what, and now what. Like Howard Cosell, I relive those moments, and I think exactly what happened. Then I talk and I think about how it made me feel. And by understanding how it made me feel, it gives me energy towards figuring out how I'm going to make a change. And that's what I do. I figure out now what? Now what am I going to do? How am I going to use this thing to make me more powerful? You see, because these books that we're given in life are an opportunity for winning. We might not choose them, but they're the opportunity for us to grow, whether we want it or not. You see, you don't have to be held down by your books. You can learn to be strengthened from them. Because, if I'm holding all these books, I can't do jumping jacks. I can't bend down and touch my toes so well, right? But if I learn how to use them in a logical way, I can begin to make them tools for success. You see, what I started doing is I started looking at each book and I started summarizing them one at a time. In the business world, we write these things called executive summaries. Cole's Notes, the only way I got through Shakespeare. But we write these executive summaries. And that's when we figure out what this whole thing was about, and then we put it down. And now I've got a tool. I've got a thing I can use. Whether it's I'm divorced. Well, my mom and dad got divorced. I got divorced. I know that affects my kids. But you know what? I learned something about how to love my kids because of that. I learned how to love myself because of that. I got the list book. I learned from that. I grabbed the executive summary out of each one of these books. Each one of these books gives me the opportunity to learn and gather tools. And these tools, and they're a lot easier to carry than the books, right? And you know what you do with them? You don't carry them around. You don't pin them on your chest. You take them, you fold them up neatly, and you put them in your pocket. And they're there when you need them. They're there when you need to understand how that tool can help you to move forward. You see, because they are our gifts. I had a lisp. In grade 2, I spent the majority of my grade 2 class either in the principal's office, that's because I have ADHD, or I was sitting in the seminar room tracing the letter S on a piece of paper so that I could learn how to speak properly. So I could learn how to structure my mouth so that I could say the letter S. Well, you know what? Is it a problem or is it an opportunity? Because now I have a certified speaking professional. I'm in the Canadian Speaking Hall of Fame. Not bad for a kid with a lisp, right? When I was in university, my professor called me illiterate. He's probably right. I read some of the papers I wrote. They were bad. But you know what? He gave me the drive, the energy to realize that I can do something better. And I learned how to hire an editor. I learned how to write about things I cared about. And you know what? I've done that 28 times. I even have a couple of bestsellers. And you know what I did with one of my bestsellers? I walked into that very professor and I said, hey, how's that book that you wrote doing? And he sold 500 copies. I said, awesome, here's my bestseller. Right? But you use those tools to your best of ability. I was the fat kid. I was tub of lard. My mom called me husky. But I was fat, right? And I was that fat kid. Now, I'm not a Vision. I'm not Adonis. I'm not, Fabio in any stretch of the imagination. But I go to the gym a few times a week. I try to eat healthy. I try to do things that are right for my body. I go for walks in the woods most times, not today, because we're in a fire band for those of you in TED Talk land. I do the things that I can do to try to be healthy. You see, because that's putting those tools in my pocket. I have attention deficit disorder, ADHD, right? That is an absolute gift for the work that I do. For 29 years, I have had the privilege of the platform. I've had the privilege to travel internationally, talking to people about creating great success, about team building, about how do we unite our teams better and make them stronger, about building engaged workforces, whether we're virtual or whether we're in person. And what I get to do is I get to go and swim with great white sharks in Australia and tell the story. I get to drive NASCAR. I get to dangle off the edge of the CN Tower. I get to fly airplanes in loop-de-loops over the Grand Canyon and tell my stories. Because guess what? That is the dream of the little boy who has ADHD. I can either look at these things and I can hold them in my pocket and be held down by these massive books, or I could pull out these executive summaries, and one at a time, they can teach us and give us new skills and new opportunities to be stronger. Your pain doesn't define your story. Your pain helps to elevate your story. One executive summary at a time. Thank you very much.